Folks, so welcome back. This is Holy Hermits and Hoards, the monastery in Skyrim and Assassin's Creed Valhalla. So again, this is a bit of a shift in focus. Instead of looking at the Vikings themselves, we're going to be looking at a part of the early medieval landscape that played a significant role in the Viking Age, and which appears in various forms in two of our case study games. So this, of course, is the monastery, most famous in the Viking Age for being raided due to its tendency to hold many shiny things, as well as people who were capable of writing about the terrible ordeals they suffered at the hands of the Northmen. The monastic nature of so many of our sources from outside Scandinavia is one of the reasons why we have to take so many of them with a significant grain of salt. So what we're going to do is cover a brief introduction to the monastic movement and then look at it in the context of Skyrim and Valhalla. So, forgot. We had a lead-in slide here. I'll just give you a moment to glance at that. Just a summary of what I said. All right, so amongst early Christians, there were those who liked to travel out into deserts or onto islands or the like in order to separate themselves from the world and dedicate themselves to a purely spiritual life. These holy women and men practice what we call asceticism. There are a range of different ways to do this. You didn't have to flee to the desert. It just started in, the Near East, so that was a legitimate way to do it. You could live an ascetic life within your own home. You could live in cells attached to churches, in which case you're called an anchorite, not a hermit. The problem, of course, is that a true hermit's life, an individual solitary life, was quite dangerous, not just spiritually but also physically. Unless you were a famous holy man, you weren't likely to have followers flocking to you to bring you food or supplies. And if you spent 40 years in the desert by yourself, you were likely to go a little crazy. One of the most extreme examples of asceticism that we have are the pillar saints from Syria. So Syria doesn't have deserts, really. It has a lot of rocky valleys. And so what these pillar saints did is they would build enormous pillars, and we're talking, 40, 50 feet in the air. They would go up onto those pillars, and then they would spend decades living there. There was one who supposedly had himself chained to his pillar, and by the time he died 30 years later, his legs had rotted away. Yeah, pretty gross. Not everybody can manage a hermit's life, basically. But many who couldn't were attracted to hermits as spiritual teachers. So what happened is that people started to strategize ways that you could still have an ascetic life without taking all of these risks. And one monastic, Pachomius, in the 4th century, figured out the first way we have to address this. So he brought his disciples together into larger communities, basically monastic villages. So monks would have their own huts, and they would support themselves with manual work, but they would come together for the liturgy, and they'd be under the control of a figure known as the spiritual father, or the Abba. And from this we get the word abbot. Now, it's important to point out that at this point, the communal life is not the point of it all. It was meant to be a sort of primary school where you were supposed to train and then go out to be a hermit or an anchorite on your own. There were communities of female ascetics in this period, but they were not expected to go off and live individual lives afterwards. In fact, when they did, they were sometimes very badly treated. Individual women on the loose, not a good thing in the 4th century. But the communal life had attractions. It had something very enjoyable about it because it was more moderate, and yet it still gave the spiritual benefits. So a new form of ascetic existence gradually evolved, and this is the monastic movement. So in the West, what we see are house monasteries. These are monasteries created by aristocrats on their estates, and they would live a sort of modified ascetic lifestyle on their own estates with their friends and companions. You see a lot of this in Rome, for instance. It's very common for these house monasteries to have spiritual guides. St. Jerome served as one until he left for Bethlehem. You also had monasteries founded by bishops that were meant to be more permanent institutions. A lot of bishops wanted to be monks in this period because the position of bishop was very political, and they had a lot they had to do. So a lot of them dreamed of retiring to a monastery and living out their lives as a monk. And sometimes they didn't wait until they were tired, they just went. Westerners were very interested in learning more about how to be good monks, so you saw monastic teachers appear. One of the most famous is John Cassian, who moved to Marseille in France and set up male and female monastic communities. He wrote his first work, The Institutes, in 420 CE. It was basically a collection of rules for monastic life. And he also popularized the teachings of numerous Egyptian holy men in a work called The Conferences, written sometime later. Now, these were written in Latin, so they became highly influential in the West. Now they had literary models to follow. And what's interesting is that some of the most important and influential monasteries in the 5th and the 6th centuries were actually in Ireland. They resembled Greek monasteries because they were influenced by the Mediterranean style via the sea routes. Irish monks were very well educated and zealous. They were very good at missionary work. Interestingly, Irish abbots had no authority over their monks. Monks could come and go as they pleased, and this wasn't something that continental monasteries did. That was a little bit too loose for them. Monasticism was just very well suited to Irish society. It's one of the reasons it grew so quickly. Prior to the 10th century and the Viking Age, there are no towns in Ireland, so monasticism serves as a sort of creator of hubs. So, you'd have a giant monastery that would be an economic center where fairs would be held and that sort of thing. Ireland also was used to having a learned priestly class, the Druids, so that helped the monks find a degree of social acceptance. It should also be said that the Irish had their wandering ascetics as well. Very often they would go off and find islands off the coast and that sort of thing. But it could also involve going wandering all the way to the continent in long distance pilgrimage. So many of the Irish monasteries on the continent are founded by people who essentially self-exile from Ireland. But there is one other person we should mention. This is Benedict. Benedict of Nursia, who wrote the famous Benedictine rule. And what he did is he experimented with different types of monasticism and realized in the 6th century that, we need something better. We need something that's sustainable for a lifetime. We need moderate asceticism. So this is something that is actually very detailed, the Benedictine rule. It tells exactly what type of food and how much monks should get. They're like, yeah, you should get leather for new shoes each year. Everybody gets what they need, but no more than what they need, basically. Now, Benedict also founded Monte Cassino, which is an amazing monastery in Italy. That's the reconstructed version of the 11th century monastery. The older monastery no longer exists, and in fact, the original 11th century monastery was bombed during the war, rebuilt later, but it was a center for education in Europe for a long time. I had an old professor who used to go to Monte Cassino every summer because he was an expert on Beneventan script. And he said, it was some of the most beautiful country in the world, but you could not go walking in the fields because there was so much unexploded ordnance from the war that you're taking your life in your hands if you did so. Now, Norman Cantor, the historian, describes the Benedictine monastery as a self-contained religious spaceship. The reason he says this is that it's perfectly suited to the early Middle Ages. The only way to destroy a Benedictine monastery is to physically wreck it, because it is self-sufficient. The monks support themselves through raising herds and flocks and through farming. They feed themselves. They govern themselves according to the rule. The self-sufficiency is part of the attraction of the lifestyle. Now, obviously, the Benedictine monks would go on to develop much more significant social and political roles, but that's a story for another time and, frankly, another course. The last historical example I wanted to give you is Mount Athos. So, Mount Athos is an autonomous polity within Greece, and the peninsula, it's one of the three. If you look at Greece, there's a spot where there's a peninsula that looks like it's got three fingers, pointing downwards into the Mediterranean, and it's one of those fingers. But the peninsula contains over 20 Orthodox monasteries, and that's just one of them there, pictured. Visitors are restricted. Men can go, but they have to get permission. Women are not allowed on Mount Athos. The only exceptions that have ever been made have been very rare, one-time things. It is famous for its collection of manuscripts, for its incredible views, for the preservation of old-style religious life. It was proclaimed a place of monks by Byzantine Emperor Basil in 885, and it's been inhabited by monks ever since. And it's actually gone through something of a revival since the 1970s, because there's a lot of younger monks who go there now, specifically to work on the Mount and catalog its artistic and literary treasures. I remember I had a Byzantine history professor back in my own undergrad, and I had never heard of Mount Athos before that class, and he showed us 3 days worth of slides from his trips to Mount Athos, and it was very strange looking at this stunningly beautiful place that I would never go because, I'm the wrong gender. All right, shifting to our games now. So where we see the monastery in Skyrim is, of course, High Hrothgar, the home of the Greybeards. And it's a pilgrimage that you undergo, basically. You are told to go and see the Greybeards. They're the ones who can help you gain insight. And, this is a very sort of standard reason to go on pilgrimage, to gain advice, to gain counsel. So you begin your trek in Iverstead, this town at the base of this enormous mountain, and to go up the 7,000 steps to High Hrothgar. Or, you do like me the first time I played Skyrim and try to climb up the back way. And then slide all the way back down. I just could not figure out how you get up this mountain for the longest time. I had to consult an online tutorial. It is an interesting trek. It's long. You can't fast travel until you've done the trek once. There's snow, there's wind, there are creatures that you encounter, including a troll who can one-shot you if you're not careful at that point in the game. There's a bit of a side quest. You can take supplies from a townsman up to High Hrothgar to save him the discomfort of the climb. This is something he's done multiple times over the years to help the Greybeards, but you can do it for him. So the climb, in a way, is pilgrimage for both the character and the player. For the character, for obvious reasons. For the player, because it's actually just kind of almost like a meditative thing. You just climb and you climb and you climb, and you stop at the shrines and read what they have to say. You talk to the odd person that you find along the way. It's an interesting experience, really. Now, the key things about the Greybeards. They're an ancient order, and they live in silence to attune themselves to the voice of the sky. And they were founded by Jurgen Windcaller, who was a general who turned away from violence and developed the way of the voice. He believed that the Fahum should only be used to worship the gods, not to fight. And the Greybeards very rarely speak. They spoke Tiber Septim's name, and then they summoned the Grey Dragonborn during the game. Ulfric was one of their students, but he decided not to stay. So, High Hrothgar and the Greybeard Order are very clearly modeled after medieval monasticism. The respect that they're held in by the people of Skyrim, the support they receive from the local town, their preference for silence, their isolation, all of this is a close parallel. Their involvement in helping negotiate an end to the Civil War is also very similar to things we see in the early Middle Ages and even the Central Middle Ages. The religious authority of an abbot could be quite significant. They could use that to intervene in conflicts. Now, where the parallel doesn't work, of course, is that you have only this one monastery in the entire landscape. And, the dragon in the backyard, obviously. But, so, it's a touch of medieval monasticism, but not more than a touch. Of course, Valhalla is completely different. It doesn't have the problem of a single monastery. The landscape is littered with them. and they are represented in great visual detail. You see them as the living communities that they were. A lot of them are under construction. They have attached settlements. You see many different crafts and economic activities going on around them. But the problem is that this visual and vivid representation is only on the visual level. You can't actually interact with these communities in great depth because the monasteries exist for one main reason, to give you some place to raid. Now, sometimes they do have the location of information or a target, but that's much less common. Usually what you do is, rock up to the front gates with your longship, blow your horn, and raid the place. This involves setting it on fire and opening various treasure chests to find supplies and raw materials to upgrade your own settlement, Ravensthorpe. You also wind up fighting soldiers. You don't fight monks. The monks and any civilians are regarded as the non-combatants by the game. So if you attack them, eventually you desynchronize from the animus, you die. So there are some problems here. Firstly, raiders would not really have recognized non-combatants, and even if they had, the chances were pretty good they would have taken them as slaves. We have plenty of records of that. Ireland was a particularly notorious place for that sort of thing. The Vikings would raid monasteries on holy days and grab hundreds of people at a time, we're told. Another issue, what are all the soldiers doing there? Yes, early medieval monks did sometimes fight, especially in places like Ireland and other northern areas. That doesn't mean they had large numbers of armored troops hanging around guarding their monasteries. And finally, what are all the supplies doing there in the first place? Monasteries aren't warehouses. I mean, I'm not saying that they wouldn't have stored building materials, but they weren't the early medieval version of, home hardware or Lowe's. And Vikings, just as a general rule, didn't raid for building materials. It's just a very, very odd choice, and one of the few aspects of the game that just baffled me when I first encountered it. So they do a little better when they try to work it in narratively. Not a lot, but a little bit. I'm just going to cover some monastic snapshots, you might say. So there are a number of references to monasticism in the world events. And if you remember, these are Valhalla's version of side quests, little encounters that you have as you travel the landscape. Some are for comedic effect, some illustrate different aspects of Scandinavian or English culture. And they build up the world. Now, you still don't get a lot of historical depth to the portrayal of monasteries. In fact, there are an awful lot of killer nuns for some reason. One of the writers appears to have had a favorite theme. If you look at how many killer nuns or abbesses there are in the main part of the story as well. Sometimes the clergy come in for some mockery, too. There's one world event where you have a rather disheveled-looking bishop who calls himself the Bishop of the Ruins. So, that implies he's really kind of a hermit who has declared himself a bishop. This happened, especially in the early period. He's a bit of a fanatic. He's trying to stop a group of bards from performing. Ivor intervenes, fights with the Bishop of the Ruins, and the bards, who are delighted when he drives the man off, sing a song in his honor. And the song is called Smack My Bishop. And the world event, and this made me start laughing because I knew the song, of course, but the world event when the title came on was called The Prodigy. So it's a reference to the electronic group, The Prodigy, and their song "Smack My Bitch Up" from the Matrix, which that is fairly well known. I think I may be aging myself by saying it's fairly well known. I don't know. The lead bard is even called Keith after the lead vocalist of The Prodigy. Now, another interesting world event, somewhat less funny, is one called Sisters of the Axe. There's a group of nuns determined to get a holy object, a crozier, basically a processional staff, usually carried by a bishop, which is kind of interesting, back from some guards. Ivor accompanies them, fights alongside them, and admires their technique. It's not usual for nuns to be fighting, but they were sometimes capable of violence under duress. There's a famous story from the Abbey of Coldingham, the nunnery of Coldingham, where the abbess supposedly learned that the Vikings were on their way to raid the nunnery and said to her nuns when she gathered them all together, "I can save us from being raped and dishonored. You just have to do exactly what I do." So all of her nuns agreed. She takes out a knife, slices off the tip of her nose and her upper lip. And we are told that all of her nuns followed suit, and they all went, stood in the church, and sang, at which point the raiders, when they came in, faced with a whole church full of bloody-faced, mutilated nuns, just kind of backed out slowly, and then set the place on fire. So they died, according to the story, which I hope is apocryphal, but, they died and were not dishonored in death. Now, there's another world event called the Anchoress, where Ivor encounters a female hermit enclosed beneath a church and talks her into coming out and going off to live her life. There's an online columnist who took great offense to this, said it was mocking Christianity. I think that's a bit excessive. It is suffice to say, as I said, that a hermit's life is not a psychologically healthy life. And yeah, it was a Christian life, but it's not good for people to be walled up underneath a church. It's just not. And this young woman was a young woman, and so he helps her out. And she goes off to live her life and enjoys the beauty of the night when he helps her out. Now, one of the most impressive instances of references to monasticism to me was a world event called the Cult of St. Guthlac. So you help a monk that you find on the road whose apple cart has been overturned. He's a very pleasant fellow, and he just wants some help carrying the apples back to where he lives. So where he lives is a small sanctuary to St. Guthlac. And the reason he's carrying apples is that it's the saint's day, and they're going to celebrate by apple bobbing. Now, Guthlac was a really interesting figure. He was a hermit and an ascetic in the fens, and he had a number of followers who sort of hung out there in the fens, celebrating his life after he died. And this little community is depicted as having, a very rustic lifestyle, but a very good one, basically. Now, there are some other aspects we could cover. As I said, I'm really kind of bothered and intrigued at the same time by the repetition of killer nuns and abbesses. But I think just going over this, it shows you some sense of how the monastic life does show up in Valhalla. It's not one of its unalloyed successes in historical representation. But in general, it's still interesting in places, and questioning why they made the choices that they did is worthwhile. I mean, why so much focus on hermits, for instance? Well, they're more dramatic, and they're more individual. Their reasons for doing what they do are individual. And they're a good contrast to the herds of non-speaking monastic NPCs who run screaming away from you every time you raid a monastery, even if you don't kill them. So it's interesting. As I said, there are flaws, but still worth looking at in some depth. Okay, that should do it for this one, and I will be back with the last of the three shortly.